Chord theory for guitarists who don't play the keyboard can be a little bit tricky. There's only 6 strings here, and obviously you've got a massive array of notes on the piano, so it's easier for a keyboard player to construct chords. There are also on guitar, for example, more than one way to play exactly the same chord. So you might have something like this. Exactly the same, but obviously the tone gets darker as you go up the neck, so that may be your preference for playing in a particular place. But that chord can also be called quite a few different things. E half diminished, or E minor 7 flattened 5th, or it could be a C9 chord, or it could be G minor 6. How's all this work? Let's have a look. In this example, I'm going to work in the key of C. So right at the bottom of your screen, you can see all the degrees of the scale and the notes they are, and that will stay throughout this video just so that you can sort of just latch onto that when I'm talking through the various extensions. Now on guitar, as I said before, you could have a chord in 3 different ways. The tone becoming darker as you go further up the neck, which is standard. You've got thicker strings here and they're shorter as well, so you get less top end. So you may want to play whichever one suits you for that particular style or pickup setting or whatever it is. Now let's start with the key of C. This is a C chord. Now that I've just strummed 5 strings, I've left the low E out here because actually I want the root note at the bottom. That's a little bit sort of too bottom heavy, and actually it's the wrong note if you're playing the bass as well as your chord. So at the C is my bass note. Now I've got another C here, 1st fret on the 2nd string. Then I've got 2 E's. I've got a 2nd fret on the D string and then an E. So I've got two E's and then the G, just that open string there. So I've only got 3 different notes. So do you need to play both C's? Well, you don't. Or those 2 halves, they give you the full C chord. But of course, it sounds a bit quieter, a bit weaker perhaps if you're just doing this. Well, you could create something like that, so you've got a different sort of rhythmic backdrop and you're using 2 halves of that C chord to create something else. Now if I got my C chord here and I release my 1st finger, I get a C major 7 chord. You think that's quite bizarre. You've taken fingers away to create a more complicated chord, whereas on piano you'd have to add an extra note. On piano, the diagram is slightly easier to fathom because you're literally looking at a list of notes, whereas of course on guitar it crosses the neck, so it's a bit more tricky. So this time with the C major 7 chord, we got a B in there, and that open string is a B string. I've taken one of the C's away and made it into a B instead. So I've now have 4 different notes. I've got C, an E, which is repeated on the open E, a G and a B. So there's 4 different notes there across 5 strings. If I have put my C chord down again and add my last finger, 3rd fret on the G string, I get a C7 chord. Okay, so C7 is where the 7th is actually flattened, so it becomes a B flat. Now, when you are faced with something like C9, which was the 1st chord that I played, C9 is a C7 but with the 9th added. It's different from C add 9. C add 9 is this, where you actually add the 9th of the scale, which is the same as the 2nd. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. So it's an added D. So I've got a C chord but with a D added. So this time I've taken the C and actually moved it to a D, but I've still got a C because of my bass note. However, if you've got a bass player, you don't need to play the C at all. This is where it gets a bit more complicated, but actually a bit more useful, because we've only got really a maximum of 6 strings, and because these 2 strings are the same, it means you're likely to get repeats if you're doing barring, for example. So actually you've only got 5 strings in some cases. So if we take the chord of C9, as I said before, C9 means that the 7th has to be added. Now, because I've got the C here, I can take that away, leaving that for the bass player. That sort of thing. Now, when you have more extensions, let's say we've got C7 sharp 11. So the 11th of C is an F. So if we were to sharpen that, we get an F sharp. Now, in terms of my C9 chord, the closest of the sharp 11s is actually this one here. So you've got to find which note is that F sharp, which one is closest to your chord symbol, and then try and integrate that. So what you could do is this. You could bar across 2nd fret on the 4 strings, and then put 2 fingers in the middle to restore your 7th and your 9th. There's your C7 sharp 11. If you can do this, so that you put your reinstate the C, just to hear that chord with all its notes with respect to the root, it does help, because then you can sort of count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, sharp 11, like that. So it does help if you can do it, but it becomes a bit of a fistful of nonsense. Really hard. And of course, if you're dragging and trying to stretch, the chances are you'll change the tuning slightly of the guitar. So you can dispense with the root. Now in C9, we had the G here, which is actually the 5th of your chord. You can take the 5th away as well. It's really important. You can dispense with the root and the 5th in any chord, because actually the proper nuts and bolts of the chord, the expressive bits, the sort of flavouring is what you want to come across. So for example here with this chord, we've got the 3rd, the 7th, the 9th and the sharp 11. There's no mention of the root or the 5th anywhere there, because the bass player is doing root and 5th. Oh, yeah. So there we are. That's kind of an explanation of that. Now, if we have, I don't know, more complicated chord, for example, C13. The 13th in C is an A. Now that means that I've got my C9 chord and my 13th. The 9th in a C13 chord is actually optional. If you see C13 written, the 7th has to be there, but then you can stick any old smattering of stuff in between as well if you like. This is easier if you're on keyboard, but I could reinstate the 3rd. I could actually double my 3rd. I could have this. They're both C13, they're both completely valid, but you can make something out of those. So I've got a little counter line going with my chords as well. Now that 13th note, the A, it becomes the 6th if the 7th is now gone. So if you see C6, I've got a major chord there, C major, with my 6th. C13, C6. So whenever you see numbers that are 9, 11 and 13, it means that you have to add the 7th. And you could actually think of this as simple arithmetic sort of addition. You've got the 6th becomes the 13th if you add your 7. 6 plus 7, 13. And so on. So for your 9, for example, is the 2nd of your scale, but you add 7 to get your 9. And that's how that works. Now, the trouble is with any guitar chords, especially if you're sight reading a big band chart, you might get a bar of C7, for example, but it's actually grouped into 4 beats. It goes C7, C9, C13, C7 sharp 11. You think, really? That's just a bit mad. And actually what's invariably happening in there is that the top line, the vocal line or the brass line, is actually reflecting the harmony in the guitar parts as well. But if you are reading a big band chart and it says C7, just play C7 for the whole bar, because the line that's creating all of those extensions will be in another part somewhere. So when you are a guitarist and you're looking through and thinking, oh really? The chances are you can actually sort of do a bit of a shorthand version. Now the trouble with the sharp 11 is that it is right next to the 5th. So if you do play a standard C7 chord and you've got a vocal line that is playing the F sharp, you're going to get a clash. So the sharp 11 is actually the one to be careful of there. Flat 13 is an A flat, and it's also next to the 5th. So flat 13 is another one to be a little bit careful of. It's where the flat 13 and the sharp 11 are actually 1/2 step either side of your 5th. Now you could, as I said before, take the 5th away, which resolves that problem. C7 as just 2 notes, E and B flat. Now, because you've got sharp 11 and 13, that means you can add your 9 as well, which means that you can have just E, B flat, and D. You have no root there, and you have no 5th there, which means that your sharp 11 and your 13 are not going to get in the way. And there you are. Whereas if you've got this, play a G, sing an F sharp, you're going to get problems. Now, of course, you've got only really 4 strings in practice, because these 2 strings are kind of low for your chords. But you can have your C9. If I put my C9 here, I could flatten my last finger and actually get the root at the top, like this. Now, if I play it here, I can get another 3rd at the top. But as you can see, it's a little bit of a handful. But it becomes a bit of a handful as those frets get closer together anyway. So while this is certainly not an exhaustive, or rather, this isn't a full description of all the chords you can play on guitar, I hope that this is basically a method where you can sort of pick and choose and decide how you want to approach something.